Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Skull and Hat's Tales. I'm always curious to know where the people who watch this channel are from. So before you relax, consider leaving a comment. Now, let's get started. It began during a routine afternoon at school. I had been sent to retrieve some old equipment from a storage room in the basement, a place I rarely ventured. The air was stale, heavy with the smell of dust and forgotten things, and the dim light from the single bulb cast long shadows across the room. While searching through the shelves, my eyes caught something unusual. A cupboard tucked into the far corner, its paint peeling and the lock hanging loosely from the latch. It looked out of place, like it didn't belong there. Curiosity got the better of me. With a tug, the lock snapped open, and the door creaked ajar, revealing a collection of items that immediately set my nerves on edge. Inside were personal belongings, photographs, crumpled notes, and small trinkets that seemed to have belonged to students and staff. I sifted through them hesitantly, my unease growing with each discovery. The notes contained deeply personal details, private thoughts, confessions, and secrets, written in shaky handwriting. Then I saw it, a photograph of me taken from a distance. It was recent, judging by the clothes I was wearing, and it had been tucked into the cupboard with the others. My breath caught as I stared at the image, the realization sinking in, someone had been watching me. I slammed the cupboard shut and hurried out of the room, but the image of my photograph and the unsettling contents of the cupboard stayed with me, gnawing at my thoughts for the rest of the day. That evening, I couldn't focus on anything. The contents of the cupboard lingered in my mind like a bad dream. Why were those items there? Who had collected them? And more importantly, why was I included among the others? I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever had compiled those items might still be watching me, or worse, might have seen me find their stash. The thought was unbearable. By midnight, I had made up my mind. I wasn't going to leave those things there for someone else to find. If the items were destroyed, maybe I could bury the whole unsettling incident. I returned to the school under the cover of darkness, breaking into the basement storage room. My heart pounded as I gathered the photographs, notes, and trinkets into a bag, my ears straining for any sound of approaching footsteps. Back at home, I dumped everything into a metal bin in my backyard and doused it with lighter fluid. The flames roared to life, consuming the photographs and papers. The heat stung my face as I watched the items blacken and curl, their details fading into ash. When the fire died down, I felt a brief wave of relief, but it didn't last. As I stared at the smoldering remains, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just invited something far worse. The next morning at school, the halls felt different, quieter, heavier, as though the air itself was waiting. I told myself I was imagining things, that I'd done the right thing by burning the items. But as I walked to my locker, I felt a prickling sensation, like someone's eyes were on me. Turning, I caught sight of a hooded figure standing at the far end of the hallway. They were partially obscured by the crowd, their face hidden beneath the hood's shadow. I blinked, and they were gone. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, but I couldn't shake the unease that followed me. As I left school that afternoon, I spotted the hooded figure again, this time standing near the edge of the schoolyard. They didn't move, didn't come closer, just watched. When I turned to look again, they had disappeared into the crowd of students heading home. That night, I barely slept. Every sound outside my window made me jump, and I couldn't stop myself from peeking out the curtains, half expecting to see someone standing there. Over the next few days, the hooded figure appeared more frequently, always at a distance, always watching. Sometimes I saw them across the courtyard during lunch, their face still obscured. Other times it was in the hallway, blending into the throng of students but unmistakably there. At first I tried to convince myself it was just a coincidence. Maybe I was paranoid, seeing patterns where none existed. But then the small incidents began. I found my locker slightly ajar one morning, though I was certain I had closed it tightly the day before. My notebook had been moved, pages rifled through, though nothing was missing. At home, my bag felt lighter than usual, and I realized a pen I always carried was gone. The final straw came during an after-school study session in the library. I was alone in a quiet corner when I heard a faint scratching noise, like nails against wood. It was coming from behind one of the shelves. I stood, my heart pounding, and stepped closer to investigate, but the noise stopped abruptly. Peering around the shelf, I saw no one. Yet, as I returned to my seat, I felt the same prickling sensation on the back of my neck, as if someone was watching me. The hooded figure's presence became impossible to ignore. Every time I saw them, the same questions circled in my mind. Who were they? What did they want? And most disturbingly, did they know about the cupboard? One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the streets grew quiet, I decided to take my usual route home. I told myself that the figure wasn't following me, that it was all in my head. But halfway through the walk, I noticed a shadow moving steadily behind me. I glanced back, my pulse quickening. The hooded figure was there, keeping pace at a distance. Their movements were unhurried, deliberate, as if they knew I couldn't escape. My first instinct was to quicken my pace, but the figure did the same. Panic surged through me as I realized they weren't just watching this time, they were following. I turned a corner sharply, veering into a quieter street, but the echo of footsteps behind me confirmed they hadn't lost me. My breathing grew shallow as I darted into an alley, hoping to shake them. I crouched behind a dumpster, straining to hear anything over the pounding of my heart. For a moment, there was silence, and I dared to hope I'd lost them. Then came the faint crunch of gravel. They were close. The footsteps stopped directly in front of the alley. I held my breath, the cold air stinging my lungs. Peering around the edge of the dumpster, I saw the hooded figure standing at the alley's entrance, their face still obscured in shadow. They didn't move, but the way they stood, completely still as if waiting, was more unnerving than if they had come toward me. Gathering every ounce of courage, I grabbed a loose piece of wood from the ground and stepped out of my hiding spot, ready to defend myself. But the figure didn't react. Instead, they tilted their heads slightly, as if studying me. I took a step back, then another, and suddenly they turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness of the street. I didn't wait to see where they went. I sprinted out of the alley and toward home, my legs burning with every step. When I finally reached my front door, I slammed it shut and locked it, pressing my back against the wood as I tried to catch my breath. That night, I barely slept. Every noise outside made me flinch, and I kept the lights on until dawn. The next day, I half expected to see the hooded figure again, either lurking in the schoolyard or blending into the crowd in the hallways. But they were gone. For the first time in weeks, I managed to walk to class without feeling watched. My locker remained undisturbed, and my belongings stayed where I left them. By the end of the day, I began to wonder if I'd imagined it all, if the stress of the cupboard and its contents had finally caught up to me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. I found myself checking over my shoulder more often than I cared to admit, scanning every corner of the school for a hint of the figure. I even ventured back to the basement storage room one evening, my curiosity getting the better of me. The cupboard was still there, but it was empty now, the shelves bare and the space devoid of the unsettling energy I had felt before. Had burning the items been enough to end it, or had the stranger simply decided to leave me alone? I had planned this trip for months. Life in the city had become suffocating, and I needed space to breathe. The campsite I chose was deep in the wilderness, far from the beaten trails, surrounded by dense forest on all sides. It was perfect, a place where I could be truly alone, with only the sounds of nature as my companion. The late afternoon sun filtered through the towering trees as I pitched my tent and set up my small fire pit. Everything felt peaceful, just as I'd imagined. That feeling didn't last long. As I walked to a nearby stream to collect water, I spotted someone else, a camper. They were at least 100 yards away, barely visible through the trees. Their tent was small and nondescript, blending into the surroundings. What stood out was their stillness. They weren't moving or setting up camp. They were just standing there, facing my direction. I waved, more out of instinct than friendliness. They didn't wave back. I shrugged it off. People camped for all kinds of reasons, and some preferred to keep to themselves. Still, something about their presence unsettled me. I hadn't expected anyone to be this far out, and their behavior seemed off. Back at my site, I tried to shake the feeling, focusing on lighting a fire and cooking my first meal under the open sky. Yet, as the evening wore on, I couldn't stop myself from glancing in their direction. The camper was no longer visible, but the knowledge of their presence lingered like a shadow. The next day, I went about my plans, hiking trails, photographing the area, and enjoying the solitude I'd craved for so long. Every so often, though, I would catch sight of the camper. They were never close, always staying just at the edge of visibility. It was as if they were deliberately keeping their distance, but still ensuring they were within sight. Once, as I was returning to my camp with an armful of firewood, I saw them again. This time, they were pacing back and forth near their campsite. It wasn't aimless pacing. It seemed almost ritualistic, like they were following a precise pattern. I paused, watching them for a moment. The air around me felt heavy, the kind of silence where even the birds go still. Then, without warning, they stopped mid-step and turned to face me. I couldn't see their features clearly, but I could feel their gaze, unblinking and fixed. That night, as I sat by the fire, I heard the first noise. It was faint at first, a soft rustling in the leaves. I brushed it off as an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer, but then the sound grew louder, closer. I froze, my back to the tent, listening intently. The rustling stopped, replaced by the sound of light, deliberate footsteps. I turned quickly, holding up my flashlight, but saw nothing. I told myself it was my imagination, that I was simply unused to the isolation. But the fear that took root in my chest was undeniable. On the third night, I was jolted awake by the sound of movement outside the tent. This time, it wasn't subtle. Branches snapped, and I could hear heavy footsteps crunching the ground. Heart pounding, I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent as quietly as I could. What I saw made me freeze. The camper was sitting at my fire pit, their back to my tent. The fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows across their hunched figure. They were singing. It wasn't a song I recognized, just a low, tuneless melody, almost a hum, punctuated by dissonant notes. I stepped out of the tent, my voice trembling as I called out, "Hey, who are you? What are you doing here?" The singing stopped instantly. The camper stiffened, then slowly turned their head to look at me. For a brief moment, we locked eyes, and I felt an overwhelming urge to step back. Without a word, they rose to their feet and disappeared into the darkness, leaving the faint smell of smoke and damp earth behind. By the next morning, I was on edge. I kept replaying the events of the night in my head, trying to make sense of them. Who was this person, and why were they acting so strangely? Every instinct told me to pack up and leave, but I hesitated. I didn't want to give in to fear, to abandon the trip I'd planned for so long. Instead, I decided to keep my distance and observe them during the day. Their behavior became even more unsettling. From my campsite, I could see them standing outside their tent, watching me. Whenever I moved, whether to fetch water or collect firewood, they moved too, always mirroring my actions. It felt calculated, almost predatory. I tried to approach them once during the afternoon, walking cautiously toward their campsite. As soon as I was within 50 feet, they turned and walked away, vanishing into the trees without so much as a glance back. That night, I didn't sleep. I stayed in the tent, clutching a flashlight and listening for any sound that might signal their return. The forest outside seemed unnaturally quiet, and every rustle of the wind felt like a warning. By morning, I was running on nothing but nerves. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being toyed with. Determined to confirm my suspicions, I decided to search the perimeter of my campsite before leaving for the stream. As I walked around, I noticed subtle but clear signs that someone had been there. Footprints, larger than mine, pressed into the damp earth near my tent. A few of my supplies, including a spare flashlight and a water bottle, had been moved slightly from where I'd left them. It was clear now. The camper had been coming to my site when I wasn't around. I scanned the forest's edge for any sign of them, but saw nothing. The sense of invasion was suffocating. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a shared camping space. This person was watching me, moving through my space, leaving no explanation. I spent the rest of the day near my tent, unwilling to wander too far. But even there, I felt exposed. Every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves made me jump. I thought I saw movement a few times. just a flicker of shadow between the trees, but it was always too quick to be sure. I tried to focus on keeping my fire going and preparing my next steps. My mind was torn between two options: pack up and leave immediately, or wait out one more night to leave at first light. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, the forest transformed into a maze of dark shapes and shifting shadows. My heart sank as I realized I had waited too long to leave. Traveling the trail in the dark was too dangerous. I had no choice but to endure one more night. That night, I didn't even bother trying to sleep. I sat in my tent, fully dressed, clutching my flashlight, waiting for any sign of movement. The fire outside had burned down to embers, casting a faint orange glow through the tent fabric. Then, the noises started. First, it was the sound of twigs snapping, soft, deliberate. Then came the footsteps, heavier this time, circling the campsite in an unhurried rhythm. I held my breath, straining to hear every sound. The footsteps stopped suddenly, replaced by a faint scratching noise. It was coming from the far side of the tent. Adrenaline surged through me as I unzipped the tent and stepped out into the cold night air. My flashlight beam swept across the campsite, landing on the camper. They were standing just beyond the dying fire, their face illuminated in brief flashes of light as the embers flickered. They weren't moving, just watching me with a strange intensity. "Who are you? What do you want?" I shouted, my voice breaking with fear. They didn't respond. Instead, they slowly stepped backward, retreating into the darkness. I could hear their footsteps receding until they disappeared completely, leaving me standing there, trembling in the cold. I returned to the tent, but sleep was impossible. I sat there, wide-eyed, clutching my flashlight until dawn. As the first light of morning filtered through the trees, I wasted no time. My body was stiff and aching from the sleepless night, but I forced myself to move quickly. I dismantled my tent, packed my gear, and extinguished the fire. My hands trembled as I worked, the lingering fear making every small task feel monumental. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every so often, I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see the camper lurking at the edge of the forest. But the campsite was eerily quiet, save for the occasional call of a bird or rustle of leaves in the wind. As I strapped on my pack and prepared to leave, a sudden movement caught my eye. In the distance, just beyond the tree line, I saw them. They were standing there, still as a statue, watching me. This time, I didn't hesitate. I turned and began walking down the trail, refusing to look back. My only thought was to put as much distance between us as possible. It started as an ordinary day. My phone buzzed with its usual notifications, emails, messages, and calendar alerts. But amidst the routine, one stood out. A reminder for an appointment I didn't remember setting up. It simply read, "Appointment 3 p.m., 117 Arlen Grove." I stared at it for a moment, trying to recall if I had made the entry. The name and address meant nothing to me. I opened my calendar app, hoping for more context, but there were no additional details. Just the address, neatly logged between my usual meetings and errands. I even checked my emails and messages, wondering if someone had forwarded me an event that synced automatically. Nothing. A quick online search for 117 Arlen Grove turned up nothing useful. No business, no personal residence, just a blank. I should have ignored it, but curiosity gnawed at me. Maybe it was a mistake, I thought. Or maybe someone I knew was expecting me and had somehow forgotten to provide more context. The possibility of a strange coincidence, or a minor mystery, sparked something in me. I told myself I'd check it out. Worst case, I'd find nothing and be home in time for dinner. By early afternoon, I was on my way, my phone perched in its holder, guiding me along the route. The drive started like any other, with familiar streets and traffic lights, but soon I was on quieter roads, then unpaved paths. The buildings grew sparse, the signs of civilization thinning, until I found myself alone, surrounded by overgrown fields and towering trees. The phone chimed, signaling my arrival. 117 Arlen Grove, the GPS announced, though no grove or street sign marked the location. I slowed down and scanned the area. Just ahead, I saw a small structure tucked between the trees, a cabin, or maybe a shed. It looked old, its walls weathered and gray. The faintest trail of smoke rose from somewhere behind it, but there were no cars, no people, no signs of life. This was it. I parked a short distance away, the gravel crunching under my tires. My hand hovered over the ignition key for a moment before I turned it off. A part of me wanted to leave immediately. The place didn't look inviting, it barely looked inhabited. Yet I felt compelled to step out. Maybe there was a simple explanation. Maybe I'd find someone to clear up the mistake. I grabbed my phone and got out of the car. The air was still, heavy with the damp smell of earth and wood. As I walked toward the structure, the sound of my own footsteps on the gravel felt unnaturally loud. I paused near the edge of the clearing, scanning the area. The structure had no visible signage or address. Its windows were opaque, coated with years of grime, and the door was slightly ajar. I called out, "Hello?" My voice echoed faintly, swallowed by the silence. No response. I hesitated. A part of me screamed to turn back, to leave before I crossed a line I couldn't uncross. But curiosity, or perhaps stubbornness, urged me forward. I approached the door, peeking inside. The interior was dim, lit only by shafts of sunlight filtering through gaps in the wooden planks. The room was nearly empty, save for a single wooden chair in the center and an overturned crate in one corner. It didn't make sense. There was no one here. No reason for this appointment to exist. I took a step inside, the floor creaking under my weight. The smell of damp wood and something faintly metallic filled my nostrils. As I walked further in, my foot brushed against something, a scrap of paper lying on the floor. I picked it up. It was blank. The silence felt oppressive, as though the cabin itself were watching me. My chest tightened. I decided I'd seen enough. As I stepped back out into the clearing, I felt exposed, as if someone were observing me from the shadows. I scanned the tree line, my eyes darting between the dense foliage. There was no movement, no sign of anyone. Still, the sensation of being watched clung to me like a second skin. I made my way back to the car, my pace quickening with each step. When I reached it, I glanced back one last time. The cabin stood there, silent and unmoving, but something was different. The faint trail of smoke I'd noticed earlier was gone. The air now felt colder, sharper, as though the place had exhaled and left behind a void. Sliding into the driver's seat, I locked the doors and started the engine. Gravel scattered under my tires as I pulled away, the cabin disappearing behind me. I gripped the wheel tightly, focusing on the road. The unease stayed with me, a weight pressing down on my chest. The drive should have been straightforward, but the GPS malfunctioned. The screen flickered, the map freezing before rerouting me to the same address I had just left. I turned it off, relying on memory and road signs to guide me back. The farther I drove, the darker the forest seemed to grow, despite the early hour. I thought I was in the clear when I reached a stretch of road I recognized, a narrow lane flanked by fields. My grip on the wheel loosened, and I allowed myself to exhale. That was when I saw it. In my rearview mirror, a figure appeared. At first, it was a vague shadow against the fading light, far enough away that I couldn't make out any features. I slowed slightly, squinting to get a better look. The figure was walking, its movements slow and deliberate, staying in the center of the road. I sped up instinctively, but the figure didn't fall away. Instead, it seemed closer each time I checked the mirror. Panic clawed at me as I pressed harder on the accelerator. My car roared forward, the fields rushing past, but the figure remained. Its outline became sharper, a human shape, but there was something wrong about it, something unnatural in its proportions. I didn't dare stop. I didn't dare look back again. My focus narrowed to the road ahead, my heart hammering in my chest. When I finally reached the outskirts of a small town, the headlights of passing cars broke the darkness. I glanced in the mirror one last time. The figure was gone. The town's streetlights flickered on as I drove into its center, the amber glow a small comfort after the unnerving darkness of the forest. I pulled into a gas station, my hands shaking as I killed the engine. The steady hum of other vehicles passing by and the distant chatter of people reminded me I wasn't alone anymore. Yet, the fear didn't subside. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figure standing somewhere nearby. After filling up the tank, I went inside to pay and grabbed a bottle of water. The cashier barely looked up, and I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I should say something. Should I tell them about the figure? Would they think I was crazy? The words caught in my throat, and I left without speaking. Back in the car, I locked the doors and took a long sip of water, trying to steady my nerves. The faint sense of security from being in a populated area didn't last. As I adjusted the rearview mirror, froze. In the far distance, down the road I had come from, was the figure. It wasn't moving this time, just standing on the edge of the road, barely illuminated by the dim lights of the town's outskirts. My breathing quickened as I stared, hoping it was a trick of the light. But it wasn't. It was there, still and deliberate, as if waiting for me to make my next move. I turned the ignition and drove away, merging into the traffic of the main road. My eyes flicked to the rearview mirror constantly, searching for any sign of the figure. The roads were busier now, lined with cars and pedestrians, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still following me. Every shadow cast by the streetlights felt too long, too solid, and my chest tightened with every turn I took. I stayed on the highway for as long as I could, putting as much distance as possible between myself and the forest. My destination didn't matter anymore. All I wanted was to escape. Yet, no matter how far I drove, the unease lingered, as though I had brought something with me. The GPS, which I had turned back on for guidance, continued to glitch. At random intervals, the screen would flash the address of the cabin, 117 Arlen Grove, as if mocking my attempt to leave it behind. I turned it off again, relying on the signs to guide me, but the roads began to feel unfamiliar. It was as if the landscape had subtly shifted, leading me away from safety. Then the headlights of an oncoming car illuminated something in the distance. The figure. It was standing on the side of the road, motionless, its outlines stark against the darkness. My stomach dropped as I sped past it, refusing to look directly at it. My hands gripped the wheel so tightly my knuckles ached, and I forced myself to focus on the road ahead. Minutes passed, then hours, or so it seemed. The stretch of highway felt endless, the monotony broken only by fleeting glimpses of the figure. It never moved closer, but it was always there, just at the edge of my vision. My fear turned into a gnawing exhaustion, every nerve in my body frayed to the breaking point. Finally, a sign for an upcoming rest stop appeared. I veered off the highway and pulled into the well-lit parking area. Other cars were scattered around, and the presence of people milling about provided some relief. I parked as close to the main building as possible and stepped out, my legs trembling. For the first time in hours, I allowed myself to breathe deeply. The day began like any other. I was getting ready to leave for work when I noticed something pinned to the gate outside my house. It wasn't a package or a delivery, just a folded piece of paper, neatly tucked under the latch. My curiosity got the better of me. I stepped outside, pulled it free, and unfolded it. It was an invitation. At least that's what it appeared to be. There was no name, no title, and no indication of who had sent it. The only thing written on it was an address, nothing else. The handwriting was immaculate, each letter perfectly spaced, as though it had been written by a machine. The paper felt strange in my hands, thicker than usual, with a faintly metallic sheen. I looked around, scanning the street for anyone who might have left it. But the neighborhood was quiet, just the usual hum of morning life. The normalcy only deepened the oddness of the moment. I brought the note inside, laying it on the kitchen counter while I sipped my coffee. Who had sent it, and why? I considered ignoring it altogether, crumpling it up and tossing it in the trash. But something about the precision of the handwriting and the weight of the paper lingered in my mind. By the end of the day, I had convinced myself it was harmless. Maybe a mistake, or maybe a marketing gimmick for some new business. Yet, I couldn't shake the pull of curiosity. After dinner, I grabbed my keys, punched the address into my phone, and decided to find out for myself. The address led to an area I didn't recognize. As I drove, the familiar streets of my neighborhood gave way to quieter, less populated roads. The houses became sparser, their windows darkened, and the occasional streetlight flickered against the growing shadows of the evening. The GPS guided me through a maze of narrow streets until I found myself in a part of town that seemed almost forgotten. The houses here were older, weathered by time, and spaced far apart. Eventually, the houses gave way to empty lots and open fields. I double-checked the address on my phone. 117 Brookline Road. It was correct, but there was no house, no building, just a shed. It stood alone at the end of a dirt driveway, its roof sagging slightly under the weight of age. A faint light seeped through the cracks in the wooden slats, and I could hear muffled voices, though I couldn't make out what they were saying. I parked at the edge of the driveway, my heart pounding. Something about the shed felt wrong, out of place. But I had come this far, and I wasn't about to leave without at least seeing what was going on. I stepped out of the car and approached cautiously, my footsteps crunching softly on the gravel. The closer I got to the shed, the stranger it felt. The light inside flickered faintly, casting eerie patterns through the gaps in the wooden panels. The muffled voices grew clearer but still incomprehensible, like a low, rhythmic chant. I stopped a few feet from the structure, crouching down to peer through a narrow gap in the wood. What I saw made my stomach tighten. Inside, a group of men sat in a perfect circle. There were at least a dozen of them, all dressed identically in black suits, with their heads bowed slightly forward. Their hands rested on their laps, motionless, as if they were waiting for something. The light inside was dim, coming from a single bulb that swung slightly, casting shifting shadows across the room. No one spoke. The chanting I had heard was gone now, replaced by a heavy, oppressive silence. I watched for a moment longer, my breath catching in my throat as one of the men slowly lifted his head. Though I couldn't see his face clearly, I felt the intensity of his gaze, as if he could sense I was there. A sudden creak broke the silence. The shed's door opened slightly, and I ducked down instinctively. My heart pounded as I tried to steady my breathing. I stayed still, listening for any sign of movement. The muffled sound of boots on gravel reached my ears, growing louder with each step. I couldn't stay there any longer. My fear had overwhelmed my curiosity. Slowly, I backed away from the shed, trying to stay as quiet as possible. But before I could reach the car, a voice stopped me cold. "You don't need to be afraid," the man said. His tone was calm, almost soothing, but it sent a chill through me. "The organization will bring many good things to you." I turned. Standing just outside the shed's door was a man dressed like the others, his silhouette outlined by the faint light from inside. He wasn't chasing me or trying to stop me. He simply stood there, his posture unnervingly relaxed, as though he had been expecting me. For a moment I was frozen, my body locked in place. Then instinct took over. I ran. I didn't care how loud my footsteps were or how much noise I made. I just needed to get out of there. I reached the car, flung the door open, and jumped inside, fumbling with the keys before starting the engine. As I pulled away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The man was still standing there, watching me. He didn't move, didn't follow. He just stood there, as if he knew I wouldn't forget. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away. The quiet, desolate streets slowly gave way to more familiar surroundings, but the sense of relief I expected never came. My mind raced, replaying every moment I had spent near the shed. The sight of those men, the way they sat perfectly still in that strange circle, and most of all, the man's cryptic words, they clung to me, heavy and unsettling. I glanced in the rearview mirror repeatedly, half expecting to see a car tailing me or a figure in black stepping out of the shadows. But the roads were empty, as if the town itself had swallowed the strange place and everyone in it. I kept driving until I reached a gas station on the outskirts of town. The bright lights and the sight of other people brought me a fleeting sense of security. I parked near the entrance, my hands trembling as I shut off the engine. For a moment, I just sat there, staring at my own reflection in the windshield. My face looked pale, and my eyes darted nervously to every shadow. The voice of the man from the shed echoed in my mind. "The organization will bring many good things to you." The calmness in his tone had been worse than if he had shouted or threatened me. It was as though he truly believed what he said, as though he was certain I'd be involved, whether I wanted to be or not. I didn't stay long. The gas station, though well lit and busy, felt too exposed. I drove the rest of the way home with a growing sense of dread, locking all the doors behind me as soon as I stepped inside. Back in the safety of my house, I tried to shake the feeling of unease, but it refused to leave me. I double-checked the locks on the doors and windows, drawing the curtains tightly. The invitation, which I had tossed onto the kitchen counter earlier, caught my eye. I approached it hesitantly, as though it might reveal something new. The address was still there, written in that same meticulous handwriting, but now it felt heavier, almost sinister. I considered burning it or shredding it, but something stopped me. What if destroying it somehow made things worse? What if they took it as a challenge? Instead, I folded it and stuffed it into a drawer, trying to convince myself that I could forget about it. But the house didn't feel safe anymore. Every creak of the floorboards, every shift of light through the curtains made my skin crawl. At one point, I thought I heard a soft knock on the front door. I froze, straining to hear it again, but it didn't come. I peeked through the peephole, my heart pounding, but the porch was empty. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat in the living room, the lights on, gripping my phone as though it were a lifeline. Hours passed, and the fear turned to exhaustion. But even in the silence, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't truly alone. The following days were a blur of anxiety. I kept the curtains drawn and avoided leaving the house unless absolutely necessary. Even when I was outside, I felt eyes on me, though I never saw anyone. The paranoia was suffocating, but I couldn't shake it. It started with small things. I noticed a black car parked on my street more than once. It wasn't unusual for cars to be there, but this one felt wrong. It never stayed long, and I never saw who was inside, but its presence was impossible to ignore. Then came the mail. Most of it was normal, bills, advertisements, but among them was a plain envelope with no return address. Inside was a single slip of paper with a typed message. The invitation was the first step. I dropped it immediately, my pulse pounding. My first instinct was to call the police, but what would I even tell them? That I'd been to a shed, seen a group of men in black, and now someone was leaving cryptic notes? It sounded ridiculous, even to me. I decided to leave it alone, to ignore it and hope that it would stop. But the tension only grew. The invitation, which I had hidden in the drawer, began to feel like a weight pressing down on the entire house. I could almost sense it, even when I wasn't near it. A week after the initial encounter, I found another note under my front door. This one was handwritten, in the same precise style as the invitation. It read, "The good things have already begun." My hands shook as I read it. I stepped outside, scanning the street for any sign of who might have left it, but the road was empty. As I turned back toward the door, I noticed something else, a black chair sitting on the sidewalk just beyond my gate. It was identical to the ones I had seen in the shed. The sight of it sent a chill through me, and I backed into the house, locking the door behind me. It was an ordinary evening. I had just finished a long day at work and was settling into my usual routine when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I hesitated before opening the door. On my doorstep stood a delivery man holding a bag of food. The logo of a restaurant I didn't recognize printed neatly on the side. "Delivery for you," he said, smiling politely. "I didn't order anything," I replied, confused. "It's already paid for," he insisted, handing me the bag. "Enjoy your meal." Before I could protest further, he turned and walked away, leaving me standing there with the warm bag in my hands. I brought it inside, cautiously unpacking the contents. The smell was intoxicating, a blend of spices and flavors I couldn't place. Inside were dishes I'd never tried before, each meticulously prepared and presented. I debated whether to eat it. It felt strange accepting food from an unknown source, but curiosity and hunger won out. The first bite was exquisite. The flavors were unlike anything I'd tasted, rich and complex, almost addictive. I finished the meal quickly, despite the lingering unease about its origins. As I cleaned up, I tried to rationalize the situation. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe a neighbor had ordered it, and the delivery man had mixed up the addresses. I decided to let it go, though the strange delivery lingered in the back of my mind as I went to bed. The next morning, I found a small box on my doorstep. It was unmarked, wrapped in plain paper, and tied with a black ribbon. I picked it up cautiously, my heart racing. Inside was a book, an old, leather-bound volume with no title or author on the cover. The pages were blank, save for the first, which bore a single symbol drawn in dark ink. I stared at it for a long moment, trying to decipher its meaning. It looked like a spiral, with jagged lines radiating outward like fractured glass. I couldn't shake the feeling that the symbol was meant for me, though I had no idea why. I set the book aside, determined to brush it off as another strange coincidence. But the gifts kept coming. Over the next few days, I found more items left on my doorstep. A box of unmarked chocolates, a bouquet of dark purple flowers, and a small wooden figure carved in an unfamiliar shape. None of them came with notes or explanations. Each time, I felt a mix of curiosity and dread, unsure of who was sending them or why. I asked my neighbors if they had seen anyone leaving the items, but no one had noticed anything unusual. I even checked my security camera, only to find the recordings mysteriously blank during the times the deliveries must have been made. The unease grew stronger with each new gift, but the final one was the most disturbing. One morning, I found a folded map lying on the doorstep. It was old and yellowed, with intricate patterns drawn along its edges. The map depicted an unfamiliar area, with a single red X marking a spot deep in a forest. Unlike the other gifts, this one felt deliberate, as if it were an invitation or a challenge. I couldn't ignore the map. It sat on my kitchen table all morning as I went about my day, its presence unnerving yet strangely magnetic. I picked it up repeatedly, tracing the lines with my finger, trying to make sense of the markings. The map showed no street names or recognizable landmarks, only a winding trail that ended in the forest where the red X was marked. The patterns along the edges were the most unsettling. They resembled the symbol from the book, spirals and jagged lines interwoven with strange geometric shapes. They seemed to pulse slightly under the light, though I told myself it was just my imagination. I debated what to do. Part of me wanted to burn it, to rid myself of whatever strange game this was. But another part, driven by curiosity and the nagging sense that this was all connected, couldn't let it go. By the afternoon, I had made up my mind. I packed a small bag, grabbed the map, and set out to find the forest. I told myself I just wanted to confirm it was real, that there was nothing sinister about the X or the trail. Yet, deep down, I knew I was chasing answers to questions I didn't fully understand. The map led me to the outskirts of town, where the streets grew quieter and the houses more spaced apart. Eventually, the paved roads ended, and I found myself on a narrow dirt path surrounded by trees. The forest loomed ahead, dark and dense, its edges blurred by the late afternoon light. I parked my car at the trailhead, clutching the map as I stepped out. The air was heavy and damp, carrying the faint scent of moss and earth. The forest seemed alive, though no birds sang, and the usual rustle of animals was absent. It was the kind of silence that felt intentional, as though the forest were holding its breath. I followed the trail marked on the map, my steps careful and deliberate. The further I went, the more unsettling the surroundings became. Symbols were carved into the trees, their jagged spirals and sharp lines identical to those on the map. Small piles of stones, arranged in perfect circles, appeared sporadically along the path. At one point, I stumbled upon a burned-out fire pit surrounded by blackened wood and the faint outline of a larger circle drawn in ash. The sight made me pause. This wasn't random. Someone had been here recently, and they had left these marks deliberately. The trail narrowed, leading deeper into the forest. My pulse quickened as the light began to fade, the trees casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward me. I knew I was close to the X. My heart raced with anticipation and dread. The forest grew darker with every step, the canopy above blotting out what little sunlight remained. My grip on the map tightened as I navigated the narrowing trail, my breathing shallow and quick. I could feel the weight of the air pressing down on me, thick with dampness and an unnameable tension. Then I saw it, the clearing. It was marked by a circle of stones, each one perfectly placed, surrounding the center of a charred patch of earth. The remnants of a fire lay in the middle, cold and blackened, but the ashes were scattered in patterns too precise to be accidental. Around the circle, strange objects were scattered, small, crudely carved figures, broken glass jars, and bones, some animal, some I couldn't identify. The air carried a faint metallic tang, sharp and unpleasant. Symbols were etched into the trees around the clearing, larger and more intricate than the ones I had seen along the trail. They matched the spirals and jagged lines on the map, but here they seemed deliberate, almost alive, as though they pulsed faintly with meaning I couldn't understand. I stepped closer, drawn by a mix of fear and fascination. Each object seemed placed with care, as though part of a ritual I couldn't comprehend. My eyes lingered on the bones, their stark whiteness almost glowing against the dark forest floor. What had happened here? And why had I been led to this place? The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of my own breathing. As I stood there, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The first sound was faint, almost imperceptible. A low hum, distant but growing, reverberated through the air. It wasn't natural, it wasn't the rustling of leaves or the call of an animal. It was something else, something wrong. I turned sharply, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. My heart raced as the hum shifted into a deep, guttural growl, punctuated by sharp, irregular tones. It was as if the forest itself was groaning, its voice alien and hostile. The sound grew louder, echoing from all directions, making it impossible to pinpoint its source. Panic set in as I backed away from the clearing, my footsteps stumbling over the uneven ground. The noise surrounded me, rising and falling in a chaotic rhythm that made my head throb. Then came the snap of a branch. It was close, too close. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The noise had stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. For a brief moment, the forest was utterly still, and then it came again. The low growl, this time closer and sharper. Whatever was out there, it was moving toward me. I didn't wait to see what it was. Adrenaline took over, and I turned and ran, clutching the map tightly in my hand as I fled back toward the trail. The forest seemed darker now, the path harder to navigate as I stumbled over roots and rocks. The growling noise followed me, growing louder and fainter at intervals, as though whatever was chasing me was toying with me. My pulse thundered in my ears, my breaths coming in ragged gasps as I pushed myself forward. Every shadow seemed alive, every rustle of leaves a potential threat. I glanced over my shoulder but saw nothing. Still, the feeling of being pursued was undeniable, the presence heavy and oppressive, as though the forest itself were closing in on me. The symbols carved into the trees seemed brighter now, almost glowing faintly in the dark. I tried to ignore them, focusing only on the path ahead, but their jagged lines seemed to twist and writhe in my peripheral vision. My fear mounted with every step. The oppressive silence of the forest, broken only by the sound of my frantic footsteps, and the intermittent growl that seemed to echo from nowhere and everywhere at once. Finally, I saw the edge of the forest. Relief surged through me as I burst out onto the dirt road where I had parked my car. The moment I stepped out of the trees, the noise stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was as jarring as the sound itself, leaving me shaken and disoriented. I didn't pause to look back. I scrambled into my car, started the engine, and sped away, the forest receding into the distance behind me. The forest always felt different at night. By day, it was a place of peace, filled with the hum of life, sunlight filtering through the canopy above. But at night, the woods transformed. The usual sounds were muted, replaced by an oppressive quiet, broken only by the occasional rustle of unseen creatures. That night, I craved solitude. The day had been long, draining, and I needed the quiet to clear my mind. The trail near my house, one I'd walked countless times, seemed like the perfect escape. The moon hung high, its silvery light casting pale shadows on the dirt path ahead. As I walked, the stillness felt comforting. The crisp air bit lightly at my face, and my footsteps crunched softly on the gravel. I wasn't in a hurry, letting the cool night soothe my thoughts. But then something caught my eye. Far ahead, a shadow moved across the path. It was quick, almost too fast to register, but distinct enough to freeze me in my tracks. My pulse quickened as I squinted into the darkness. The figure had disappeared, swallowed by the trees. It could have been an animal, I told myself. A deer, maybe, or someone else out for a walk. Yet something about the way it moved, too upright, too deliberate, sent a chill through me. I hesitated for a moment, then shook off the unease and kept walking. It was probably nothing. The forest was quieter now, as if holding its breath. I tried to dismiss the strange feeling gnawing at the edges of my mind, focusing instead on the familiar rhythm of my steps. But with each step, my senses heightened, tuned to the faintest sound. Then, the first rustle. It was soft, almost imperceptible, coming from somewhere to my left. I stopped, scanning the trees, but the darkness was impenetrable. Another rustle followed, this time from the opposite side of the path. My skin prickled as I strained to see what was there. "Hello?" I called out, my voice breaking the silence. It echoed briefly before fading into the void. No answer. I told myself it was just the wind, maybe an animal stirring in the underbrush. But the rustling didn't sound random. It was deliberate, timed. I resumed walking, slower this time, my ears straining for the next noise. Twigs snapped somewhere behind me, the sound sharp and deliberate. My breath hitched. I turned quickly, the beam of my flashlight slicing through the dark, but the path behind me was empty. My heart thudded in my chest as I turned back and quickened my pace. Something didn't feel right. The path stretched on, winding deeper into the woods. I tried to focus on its familiarity, telling myself I had walked this trail dozens of times without incident. But the noises continued, subtle at first, then louder. Leaves rustled, branches snapped, always just out of sight. The shadows ahead seemed to shift, moving in ways that didn't match the gentle sway of the trees in the breeze. My flashlight flickered slightly, its beam catching fleeting glimpses of movement that were gone before I could focus. The sense of being watched grew unbearable. I stopped again, my breath visible in the cold night air, and swept the flashlight in a slow arc. The woods seemed alive now, every dark corner hiding something unseen. I debated turning back, but the thought of retracing my steps, venturing closer to whatever was making the noises, felt worse. I reasoned that the path ahead would loop back toward the main road if I just kept going. The logical part of my mind tried to take control, but fear gnawed at the edges of reason. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Not mine, but distinct, deliberate, and close. I froze, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The footsteps stopped as abruptly as they had started. The silence was oppressive, the kind that makes your ears strain to fill the void. Slowly, I turned toward the direction of the sound, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. And then I saw it. The figure stood partially obscured by the trees, its form just visible in the dim moonlight. It was taller than I'd expected, its posture rigid, almost unnatural. The shadows obscured its features, but I could feel its gaze locked on me, unblinking and unwavering. I wanted to speak, to ask who or what it was, but the words caught in my throat. My chest tightened as the figure tilted its head slightly, as if studying me. The deliberate movement sent a jolt of fear through me, my instincts screaming to run. It didn't move toward me, but its presence felt suffocating. It was as though the entire forest had conspired to push me toward this moment, drawing me into its silent game. My legs felt rooted to the spot, my mind racing with possibilities. Was it a person, an animal, something else entirely? The longer I stared, the less certain I became. Finally, I took a step back. The figure didn't follow, didn't react. It just stood there, watching. I couldn't take it anymore. Fear overtook reason, and I turned and bolted down the path, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly as I ran. The moment I turned to run, the forest seemed to shift around me. The path that had felt so familiar just moments ago now seemed endless, twisting unnaturally in the dim light. My breath came in ragged gasps as I pushed myself forward, every instinct screaming at me to put as much distance as possible between myself and the figure. Behind me, the forest was alive with sound. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling, the unmistakable rhythm of footsteps. They were deliberate, heavy, and relentless, matching my frantic pace, but never growing louder or quieter. Whatever it wasn't chasing me in a frenzy. It was following, deliberately, patiently. The thought sent a chill through me, and I ran harder. My legs burned as I forced myself forward, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly across the ground. Shadows seemed to reach for me, branches clawing at my jacket as I barreled down the path. I didn't dare look back. Every so often, the footsteps behind me would stop, and for a brief, agonizing moment, there would be silence. Then they'd start again, closer this time, like a predator playing with its prey. My pulse pounded in my ears, drowning out everything but the sound of my own fear. I ran without any sense of direction, relying on instinct to guide me through the maze of trees and undergrowth. The path had all but disappeared, swallowed by the forest's encroaching darkness. My flashlight flickered, the beam sputtering as the battery began to fade. Panic surged through me as the light dimmed, leaving me at the mercy of the shadows. Then, Just ahead, I caught a glimpse of movement, a flicker of black against the trees. The figure was there, somehow in front of me now, blocking the way. I skidded to a stop, my heart hammering in my chest as I scrambled to change direction. My legs trembled as I forced myself to turn back, plunging deeper into the woods. The sound of footsteps resumed, faster this time, as though it had grown tired of waiting. The forest seemed to close in around me, the branches overhead weaving into an impenetrable canopy. My vision blurred with tears of exhaustion and fear, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The figure appeared again, this time closer. Its movements were wrong, jerky and disjointed, yet somehow purposeful. I stumbled, catching myself on a low branch, and pushed forward. My lungs burned, every breath a struggle, but the thought of stopping was unthinkable. A faint glow appeared in the distance, the edge of the forest, the safety of home. Relief surged through me, giving me a second wind as I sprinted toward the light. The footsteps behind me grew louder, more frantic, as though whatever was following me sensed its prey slipping away. I burst through the trees and onto the open ground, nearly collapsing as my feet hit the familiar gravel path leading to my house. The silence that followed was deafening. The footsteps stopped abruptly, as though the forest itself had released me from its grip. I turned, gasping for breath, expecting to see the figure standing at the edge of the trees. But the forest was empty, the shadows still and lifeless. The sense of being watched lingered, heavy and suffocating, but there was no sign of my pursuer. I stumbled toward my house, my legs shaking with every step. Once inside, I locked the door, bolted it, and collapsed onto the floor, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. The call came mid-morning, just as I was about to leave for errands. A cheery voice on the other end identified themselves as a representative from Premier Repairs, a company I didn't recognize. They claimed I had scheduled an inspection for that day. "We're just confirming our appointment for 10:30 a.m. Is that still good for you?" the voice asked. Confused, I hesitated. "I don't remember scheduling anything." "Don't worry, it's already arranged," they assured me. "We'll just need about an hour for the inspection. It's for your property at address." Hearing my address made me pause. Maybe it was a mix-up with my landlord, I thought, or perhaps a standard service I had forgotten about. Before I could ask more questions, they ended the call with a polite, "See you soon." True to their word, a white van pulled into my driveway at exactly 10:30 a.m. Two men in matching blue uniforms stepped out, carrying toolkits. They waved as I opened the door. Their demeanor was professional, even friendly, as they introduced themselves. Despite my lingering doubts, I let them in. At first, everything seemed routine. They moved from room to room, commenting on fixtures and walls, occasionally jotting notes on clipboards. One of them, a wiry man with glasses, asked a steady stream of questions. "How old is this house? Have you noticed any issues with the plumbing or electrical? Do you spend a lot of time at home?" The question struck me as odd, but I chalked it up to thoroughness. The second man, taller and more reserved, rarely spoke. Instead, he lingered in strange places, the corners of rooms, closets, even behind furniture. His movements were slow and deliberate, as though he were searching for something. When I asked what they were inspecting for, the man with glasses gave a vague reply. "Just a standard check, making sure everything's up to code." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Something about the interaction felt off, though I couldn't quite put my finger on it. By the time they reached the basement, my unease had grown. They weren't looking at anything specific. No pipes, no outlets, no walls. It felt like they were just observing. As they continued, little inconsistencies began to pile up. Their van, parked outside, had a logo that read Prime Repairs, not Premier Repairs, as they'd said over the phone. Their toolkits, which they had carried inside so confidently, remained closed the entire time. The questions became more invasive. "Do you live here alone? Do you get a lot of visitors? What's your typical daily schedule?" I tried to deflect, giving curt answers and asking for clarification about the inspection. Each time they dodged the question, redirecting the conversation or brushing me off with a polite smile. When they stepped outside to check the foundation, I seized the opportunity to search my email and calendar. There was nothing, no appointment, no confirmation, no record of any kind. My heart began to race. I hadn't scheduled this visit, so who had? I called the number that had confirmed the appointment. It rang twice before going straight to voicemail. A generic recording played. "Thank you for calling. Please leave a message." No mention of the company name. Panic set in as I scrolled through my messages and emails again, searching for any explanation. There was nothing. No correspondence, no invoices, no scheduled maintenance. The visit had appeared out of nowhere, unprompted and unverified. I went to the window to check on the workers. They were standing at the edge of my yard, speaking in hushed tones. The taller one glanced back at the house, his eyes briefly locking with mine before I ducked out of sight. The moment felt like a confirmation of my worst fears. This wasn't a repair team. They were here for something else. I debated what to do. Should I confront them? Call the police? My phone felt heavy in my hand as I hovered over the keypad, unsure what to say. "There are 2 repairmen in my house, and I don't know why they're here," sounded absurd, even to me. Before I could decide, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to find the wiry man standing in the doorway, clipboard in hand. He smiled again, that same hollow expression, and said, "We're almost done, just a few more things to check." I forced a nod, my palms slick with sweat. "I don't remember scheduling this visit," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Can you show me any documentation?" His smile faltered for a fraction of a second before returning. "It's all handled through the main office. We're just the inspection team." His answer didn't satisfy me, but I didn't push further. My unease had grown into full-blown fear, and I just wanted them gone. My patience snapped. I needed answers. The tension in my chest was unbearable as I stepped closer to the wiry man, folding my arms to mask the trembling in my hands. "This doesn't add up," I said firmly. "I didn't schedule this, and you're not answering my questions. If you don't explain why you're here, I'll have to ask you to leave." The man hesitated, glancing toward his partner, who had just re-entered the house. The taller man leaned casually against the doorway, his expression unreadable. The wiry man cleared his throat, the faintest flicker of unease crossing his face. "We're just following protocol," he said, his voice measured. "The office handles the scheduling. Maybe there was a mix-up, but we're here to ensure your property is secure." The word secure hung in the air, carrying a weight that made my stomach churn. "Secure from what?" I demanded. He didn't answer. Instead, he turned to his partner, who gave a small shake of his head. The wiry man sighed and plastered that same false smile back on his face. "We'll wrap up now." Something in his tone set my teeth on edge. "No, you're done. Leave." The taller man stood straighter, his body language shifting subtly. "We're just doing our job," he said, his voice calm but carrying an edge. "There's no need to overreact." "Overreact?" My heart raced, but I held my ground. "I want you out. Now." The wiry man muttered something under his breath and started packing up his clipboard and untouched tools. His partner followed suit, slower, as though daring me to say more. As they moved toward the door, I noticed the taller man glance at the corners of the room, his gaze lingering on the ceiling and walls before stepping outside. I followed them to the door, my hand hovering over my phone, ready to call for help if they resisted. To my relief, they walked out without argument, though the taller man paused on the porch. He looked back at me, his face shadowed by the porch light. "You'll hear from us soon," he said, his voice low and deliberate. Then he turned and walked to the van where the wiry man was already waiting in the passenger seat. The engine roared to life and the van rolled down the street, its taillights disappearing into the night. I stood there for a moment, rooted to the spot, staring at the empty driveway. The house behind me suddenly felt larger, darker, and far less secure. Once inside, I locked the door, checked it twice, and drew all the curtains. My hands were shaking as I leaned against the counter, replaying the events in my mind. Their vague answers, their strange questions, the way they had moved through my home, it all pointed to one thing: they weren't repairmen. But then, who were they? The first thing I did was check every room in the house. Nothing seemed to be missing, but small, unsettling details caught my attention. A chair had been moved slightly in the living room. A window that had been closed earlier was now cracked open. The hallway closet door, which I never used, was ajar. I searched the areas where the workers had lingered, the corners, the closets, under the furniture. My paranoia grew with every step, but I found nothing. Still, the feeling of being watched persisted, as if they'd left behind more than footprints. The next morning, I called the number they had used to contact me. It rang twice before going to voicemail again. "Thank you for calling. Please leave a message." The recording was generic, offering no clues. Frustrated, I searched online for Premier Repairs and Prime Repairs. Neither name yielded any useful results. It was as if the company didn't exist. I considered calling the police, but what could I report? Two men entered my home, looked around, and left. There was no proof they had done anything wrong. That night, I noticed an unfamiliar car parked down the street. It wasn't unusual for cars to pass through the neighborhood, but this one stayed, its headlights off. I watched it from behind the curtains for hours, waiting for some sign of movement, but no one got out. When I checked again later, it was gone. The unease never fully left. Days passed, and though I tried to move on, the sense of vulnerability lingered. Every creak in the floorboards, every flicker of light made my pulse quicken. The house no longer felt like my own.